Traditional gardens in many parts of the country are big expanses of lawn, and so the tendency with a xeriscape garden is just to figure out how to replace that lawn with something that doesn't take water, and that's not how I think about a functional, attractive, appealing xeriscape garden. I think you should think even more about the use of the garden. And so this idea of useful spaces is even more applicable in xeriscape gardens. And you can use plant material, as you see, we've picked some things here that are extremely water efficient, and you would never know they're water efficient because they almost have a lush look about them. Since we're in an existing garden that has existing trees all around it, there's certain parts of the yard that are shady, and so we have sections like I'm sitting in right now where the plants aren't necessarily completely water efficient. They don't take a lot of water because they're in the shade most of the day. The plants here in the shade are Mexican heather, also known as Courtyard, and this Liriope, or some people call it Liriope. Blue lily turf is the common name. And then right in front of the blue lily turf is a low-growing, white blooming ground cover that's a form of Loropetalum, and it's a white dwarf Loropetalum that stays relatively low, probably is going to stay about 18 inches tall. And in front of that we have sea lavender. On the other side of the walk that gets a lot of sun, we used the Kurapia, and in the parking strip the Kurapia under ginkgos. And then we have the St. Elmo's fire, which is a type of Russelia that's really colorful and doing very well. And we have Sedum Autumn Joy, which is just starting to bloom now, and it blooms pretty much right through the summer. And then on the other side of the walk, we did the dwarf version of iceberg roses called ice cap roses. We're in California, and I liked the fact that these owners were very much into trying to come up with something low in water use and high in usefulness. They wanted something that could kind of take care of itself, and by having these fairly large expanses of gravel and olives and paving, we've created that where it looks great, and yet we don't have to be out babying any plants or, making sure the azaleas have enough water, because there are no azaleas, and the only plants here are tough things like lantana, salvia, rosemary. So the way to limit maintenance is to just apply water minimally and only where it's needed. If you look at this garden, it's made up of massings of low maintenance, low water use plants. And if you deliver water just to where those plants are with drip irrigation, so allow it to just soak in slowly and don't put water all in between the plants, then you're not going to have weed pressures in between the plants, you're not going to have a lot of standing water, you're not going to have drainage issues. This is a key if you're trying to really minimize maintenance, minimize the need for water. This decomposed granite is another option that you can use to take up space, and it's a nice contrasting texture, works well in parking strips. In this case, you'll see it next to this bold texture of these big cobbles. So the cobbles are attractive, obviously they're low maintenance, and they give a nice look to a garden where you're trying to take up space with things that don't use water and yet still look nice. They really wanted to get away from mowing the lawn and really having kind of a front landscape that was enveloping their house. If you look at it before, they were these big shrubs that they always had to cut back, and you see this frequently. Seems to have originated with the fact that houses used to be built with ugly foundations, and so an important part of the landscape was foundation planting. In other words, planting to hide the ugly foundations. Well, we've evolved into houses that don't have ugly foundations, but the foundation planting seems to have persisted. And we're always trying to bring the plants out into the garden rather than have this row of plants up against the house that's the tallest, biggest thing. You can even look around in this subdivision and see that's still common today. A useful, important garden in my mind is if you want to minimize maintenance, to do it with plants that you can allow to grow to their natural forms, and you don't have to be clubbing them into submission in order for them not to swallow up your house. We've put in low-growing bougainvillea and Yucca filamentosa color guard, all things that are going to stay small, aren't going to need pruning. They can just pretty much let grow, and now and then do some annual pruning like on the lantana and things that get spent flowers. You can see in this house it had foundation planting and other planting that just made it almost impossible to see the house. So the first thing we wanted to do here is to reveal the house and reveal the style of it and the architecture of it. And so to open it up, that required removing a lot of plants and then replanting in a style that allows it to be somewhat open, but since it's a west-facing exposure, we still wanted to provide a lot of shade. There's existing trees here that we maintained and pruned close to the street, and then we removed almost everything that was around the house, regraded everything. Then we replanted with this line of river birch. This is a variety called Dura Heat Birch. Nice shade from the western sun, and yet it'll allow light in the winter because it does drop its leaves, and it's pretty well behaved, no root problems. We have three different things going on here. We've got a nice mulch cover, we have decomposed granite, and then we have this desert gold rock. In most landscapes, we use a mulch cover because I think that's the best for the soil. The owners, in this case specifically, requested this rock, which is becoming more popular. Some people associate it with kind of a Mediterranean, maybe / native plant look, where the plants are a little sparser and don't use a lot of water, and rock is the ground cover. As you can see on the ends of the project, because of existing landscapes it had to transition into, we used the traditional mulch. So you can see his planting on the other side of his driveway. We used a more traditional mulch because his neighbor had it, and we thought that was a better transition from one yard to the next. This is also a xeriscape garden. As you can see, the area where we're using a lawn substitute, Kurapia again, and you can see how it was planted kind of on 3-foot centers. And this was planted in late February. It's doing very well, and it's a very simple garden with big agave, which were existing, and then we added a bunch of Little John bottle brush. You can see these white multi-trunk crepe myrtles. Very simple with river rock, and very nice xeriscape garden that's low maintenance. One of the needs is this faces south, and it gets just baked in the summer, and so they wanted large trees that would shade the house over time. And then they wanted to grow vegetables in a garden without the whole yard looking like a vegetable garden. And they also wanted it to be low water using, and so they wanted a plant palette of completely low water using plants. This cobble we just set on decomposed granite, and then we put sand in between. These butterfly bush were planted then amongst the cobble, and that's a nice look here at the entrance. The trees that we used here are Keith Davey Chinese pistache, which is Chinese pistache that's grafted, and so that it doesn't have berries and guarantees the fall color, spectacular fall color. A large southern live oak. Then we used the fruitless olives lining the walk, and then we used multi-trunk Natchez crepe myrtle. You'll see 3 of them. So the nature of the plants is different on the interior courtyard, an idea that I like even in xeriscape gardens. In the entries and in close-up areas, you can have plants that require more water and are lusher. So the idea of the courtyard is it will have things like Japanese maples, an eastern redbud, lamb's ear, and variegated Liriope, and special dwarf Nandina, the smoked bush, which is a dwarf smoked bush. So this area is decomposed granite because it's going to be 3 or 4 raised planters for vegetables. And the planting idea is these shrubs, which look small right now, they'll grow together, be an informal hedge that'll be about 6 feet tall, that will screen the view of the vegetable garden from the street. But because of this exposure, we'll get a lot of sun, and it'll be a good spot to grow vegetables. You can see the entry to the garage here, and then the planting focuses on a screen where the neighbor's property can be screened using privet, which is a background screening shrub, white lantana, red Hesperaloe, and 2 kinds of Salvia, Salvia leucantha and Salvia gregii. We have the same types of planting on both sides of the driveway. And then those plants are used over and over throughout the rest of the garden. What we like to do is not use one plant here and one plant there, but come up with a fairly small plant palette and then use it in bold ways. When you mass plants, you really are affording yourself a real look into their beauty, because when they bloom all together, and they make quite an impact. One of the things that I think will pay off in the years to come, you can see these are small lots with big houses. A lot of times the mistakes are done with the size of the trees, and here we used very small trees so that we're not going to have any problems down the road with cracking sidewalks and with trees that get too close to the house and spread out over the roof and all of that. In this case, we used the Majestic Beauty Raphiolepis. Either you can think of it as a large shrub or a very small tree. It gets about 10 to 15 feet tall and grows a little bit like a lollipop. As you walk through the garden, there's a completely different type of outdoor space with the patio and some plantings and garden ornaments that they got mostly from Thailand, I think. To kind of tie in with the theme, we used this nice look of Mexican cobble. We hand placed them into decomposed granite. One ground cover is Dymondii, Dymondii, and then Asian jasmine. Then we have another type of outdoor seating area. The planting here again is more white lantana. You can see that dwarf olive shrub curves around and is a mass planting. That will provide some screen of the neighbors, and then that goes into a real big screening plant, the Texas privet, which will grow to almost as tall as you want it. And so we'll have a background screen. Instead of looking at a block wall, we'll be looking at a green screen of Texas privet. I think on the other side we used a type of Carolina cherry, so both block walls are screened. The plant palette here is the olives. In this case, we used just 4 fruitless olives in a multi-fashion. So very low maintenance, appropriate for this small garden, not going to get too big and not going to envelop the house and overpower anything, not going to crack sidewalk. Blue Glow Agave. A lot of agave would be too big for this site at 7 years old. They don't really get any bigger than this. So it's a dwarf agave. Little John bottle brush, which we used as an informal hedge. You can see those were planted pretty close together, and they're just growing together to create a separation between the courtyard and the street. On the other side of the driveway, they used Skyrocket Juniper as a screen, and then some daylilies, a little bit of blue fescue. So a simple plant palette, all easy to grow and low water use. So in selecting plants to fit with a garden like this, I like to look at lists. And so if we establish that it's going to be water efficient, then I'd look at lists of water efficient plants, and that allows you to kind of open up your brain and come up with things. So you would look at lists with the size that you want in mind, whether you want them to be evergreen or bloom, and the emotion that it evokes. It's a combination of the same way you pick out trees, making decisions based on how they function in your garden and how they meet your needs and how they are to maintain. The leading ones in this garden, I'd say, would be the height, the size, which we want to keep everything kind of secondary to these big spectacular olives. This already had Spirea Anthony water. We used that on the other side. Then we used a great screen where we're going to try to screen the neighbor house and landscape with a dwarf Japanese blueberry shrub. We've got salvia and an upright rosemary called Tuscan Blue. And then we've got a limonium. I've got some St. Elmo's fire here, which actually aren't going to stay. When we put the pots in, it's going to be agave. And then we've got some oak leaf hydrangeas, which are closer to the house, and then some existing planting.